So, what is an ancient Hebrew religious story about a man and a woman and a snake and some fruit in a paradise garden? What does that have to do with your life right now? No, don't worry, this isn't going to be a religious sermon, but I think it's got an important psychological truth in it, and that's what I want to talk about today. I'm Dr. Stephen Brownlaw. I'm the developer and originator of adept psychology. And one of the things I learned a long time ago in school, I think, I don't really remember exactly where, but there's this idea that any story that really endures, myths, legends, but really any story that really resonates with us resonates because it means something to us psychologically. It has some psychological truth to it, even if we kind of don't really believe that, we don't believe in Zeus and we don't believe in Athena maybe anymore, but those things have something to do with the psychology of how people work, and it tells us something about that. And that's the way it is with the Garden of Eden story. I'm not going to get into whether it happened or not. I tend to be a little skeptical about the fact that it actually happened exactly that way. I don't know people who really have snakes talk to them and so forth. But I want to talk a little bit about the story, and then I want to talk a little bit about what I think it means and why I think it impacts you. And so if you understand a little bit, let me give you a little context of the story, whether you've heard it or not. If you have a little context about how the story came about, then maybe it'll make more sense. But it turns out back in antiquity, my understanding was that when the ancient Israelites, I guess when they were putting their sacred texts together, they had a hard time figuring out how they wanted to start the story, because there were a lot of things that were sort of historical. They knew that Moses lived. They knew that Abraham lived. They knew that Isaac lived. They knew that a lot of these folks had lived. They knew about Moses. But when they got back much before Moses, it became rather difficult. And there were sort of two stories about how the world started, and they couldn't decide which one to start it with. So what they did is they said, well, we don't know which one happened, so we're just going to include both. And so there's two stories about how the world started, and you may not have realized that if you hadn't really paid attention. But one story is that God created the earth in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day. And in that story, sort of the earth appeared on one day, and then he created the light, and then he created the rocks and oceans, and he created the fish, and he created various plants and animals. And as it turns out, the interesting thing about that story is that for the most part, when you look at what the astronomers tell us, and the geologists and the botanists and the biologists and whoever, the story's pretty much accurate about the order that things actually did appear. Now, probably not in 6 days. I think the evidence is that it didn't all come about in 6 days, but that's sort of that story. But then there's a big shift in gears. If you read the book of Genesis, there's sort of a big shift in gears between that, where they start into the second story. And on that story, it begins on the day the earth was created, not on the 6 days the earth was created, or on the seventh day, or the next week. It was on the day the earth was created. God created a man, God created a woman, and gave him dominion over this paradise, the Garden of Eden, and told him, you can do anything you want to. You can have dominion over this. You have this. You have this. You have everything you want. It's just peace and love and understanding, and you have everything you want with one stipulation. You see that tree? That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you eat the fruit, then all bets are off. And so they kind of behaved for a little while, but then the serpent appeared, and the serpent talked to Eve and convinced her, how's this God guy, who's he, just eat a little bit, why is he trying to keep this away from you? Why is he keeping it all to himself? You should understand this. And, it's not, and besides, you can just kind of tell him you didn't eat it. And so Eve had some and offered some to Adam, and Adam had some, and then all of a sudden they realized, oh, crap, we screwed up, and they were very ashamed, and they hid, and then God went looking for them. It's like, where are you hiding? Well, we're ashamed, And when they came out, they were now wearing clothes, which they hadn't done before, and God said, okay, you clearly screwed up. You've been eating the forbidden fruit, and so therefore, not only kicking you out of the garden, but all this peace and love and joy stuff is just gone. From now on, you're going to work. You're going to work your entire life. You're going to die at the end of your life. You're not going to live forever like you were supposed to. Originally, this is going to be tough, but you got it. You violated the law. You deserve it. You're done. Now, that's the story. So what does that have to do with us? Well, it turns out there's this guy, his name was Sylvan Tompkins. He's dead now, but he was one of the first people who really started looking into emotions. And one of the emotions that he really spent a lot of time examining and looking at was shame. Now, I didn't sort of mention it, but one of the things that it very specifically says in the story is after they had Adam and Eve had eaten from the fruit, that they felt very ashamed. And this was something that Tompkins really looked at. And he started looking back, and as it turns out, when people develop, their brains develop, we look at how old people have to be to actually understand shame and to feel shame and to realize, oh, I'm a person and there's something wrong with me. And that age seems to be about 2.5 or 3.5, about 3.5. The problem with that is that we know that people who seem really shame-based have stuff that happens to them a long time before that. A year and a half, 2 years. That seems to be like sort of the prime time to develop shame. So how can that be true? Well, as it turns out, when your brains develop, when your brain developed, when my brain developed, brains develop in a specific order, and they develop bottom to top, inside to out, back to front. What happens is that one of the last things to start developing is the prefrontal cortex, and it first starts coming online right about the age of 3.5, which is right about the time, not coincidentally, that we develop a separate sense of self, which is when we can realize not only that we are a separate person, but that we are good or bad. And that realization that we're good or bad is not really so much a realization. If you've ever been around a 3-year-old as an adult, maybe you have kids, you have siblings who have kids, you've seen kids in the neighborhood, you see 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, their thinking is not very sophisticated, okay? That's the best way to say it. Things are very much, they understand now that they're a person at 3.5. They have volition, they have will, but they think everything else around them has the same kind of will that they do. So trees do things because they think like 3.5-year-olds. The wind does what it's doing because it thinks like a 3.5-year-old. The clouds do what they're doing because they think like a 3.5-year-old. And adults do whatever they're going to do because they're thinking like 3.5-year-olds. And basically the 3.5-year-old, the way they think is what psychologists call dichotomous thinking. It's very black or white. It's all good or all bad. It's it's just categorical that way. And so we have these thoughts. And so what happens, the way shame develops, according to Tompkins, is it starts developing the first time that we expect to be loved and aren't. We don't receive the love we expect. And sometimes what we receive is sort of contempt, and sometimes it's abuse. But most often it's really just, I'm too busy for that right now. I can't pay attention to your pictures right now. I'm having to deal with this. I have to cook dinner. I have to do something else is more important than you are right now. We expect love. We get that. And it feels terrible. But we don't understand what the terrible feeling is, and we protest and we have rages, and they look at rage in children, and rage goes back to like 8 or 9 months old. We have these kinds of rages because we understand that something feels horrible and we're protesting and we want it to quit feeling like that. So we might have that rage, but once we get to be about 3.5, all of a sudden, now we have a separate sense of self and we internalize it. And it's like, oh, that's that feeling. Oh, it's always happened at these times. And oh, it's because, and then you get a categorical thing, a categorical idea. It happened because there's something wrong with me. It happened because I don't deserve for people to pay attention to me. It happened because everybody knows that I'm defective. And I can't see that my defectiveness, I can't see their defectiveness, but they see my defectiveness. I'm naked. I'm uncovered. I need to cover up my defectiveness. I need to cover up my nakedness. I need to pretend that it's not there. In other words, at that age 3.5, something happens, our brain develops, and we go through our own unique individual Garden of Eden moment where we realize that there's something about us that's just rotten. And we don't deserve for God to love us. We don't deserve for our parents to love us. We don't deserve any of the good things in life. And we make up an entire bunch of stories about it that later, and because we never examine them, they become our deepest level of our identity. That there's something specifically and magically and irredeemably wrong with me. What the Protestants would call original sin. But it's all a story. It's all a story. And that's where it came from when we were about 3.5. So here's the question for you. How does that affect you? That idea that there's something wrong with you, there's something irredeemably wrong with you, that everybody knows it, that you need to hide it, that people are going to hurt you, that there's not enough love in the world for you. How do those ideas that you developed at 3.5 when you had your Garden of Eden moment, how do they impact you? How do they change your life? What are you going to do about it? Because all of that's resolvable. I help people resolve that all the time. But it's not resolvable if you do all the normal stuff that people do. It's not resolvable by pretending it's not there. It's not resolvable by doing CBT and trying to change your beliefs, because as the beliefs came second, you weren't born with the beliefs. You were born with a capacity to feel bad when people didn't love you. And you were born with an active imagination. And that's where the beliefs came from. And you're not going to change the beliefs until you resolve the shame that is supporting those beliefs, that those beliefs are based on. So I'm Dr. Stephen Brownlow, and I'm asking you, What are you going to do about it? If you want to let me know in the comments below, do that. If you want to contact me because you're finally serious about getting on with your life, I'd welcome the conversation. I love to talk to people. I'll see if I can help you. And until next time, just remember the power for everything, but mostly the power to make any impact in your own life is all up to you.